Let's blow this up.
I mean, that's like such a big question. For me personally, I think when it comes to the trans issues that I believe you're talking about, I think it's a non-issue, and I think it's people trying to just come for the trans community, and I just don't stand for that. I think I don't even know what the fuck his name is, Enes Kanter, like, he's a stupid piece of shit, and I think a lot of people think that, and I think he's just trying to stay relevant, so I think people are tuned in for the right reasons, and
That is Cameron Brink calling the controversy a non-issue and accusing Enes Kanter of using it to stay relevant. But the real story is not simply that Brink disagrees with Kanter. It is what her answer reveals about a divide that keeps getting wider around women's sports, because Sophie Cunningham took a very different public position months earlier.
Now, Sophie Cunningham brought this thing to a forefront back in February 2026 when she did an ESPN interview, and she stated that the kids need to be protected. Now, that being said, little girls should be protected from playing against men and boys in sports. Now, ever since that...
And that contrast is exactly why this keeps resurfacing. Cunningham's February 2026 comments were framed around protecting girls in sports. Brink is framing the current discussion around protecting the trans community from what she views as an unnecessary political target. Those are not just two different answers. They start from completely different definitions of what the underlying problem even is. That matters because once two WNBA players are being placed on opposite sides of a cultural argument, the conversation stops being about one interview. Now people are comparing personalities, principles, league policy, and what players should or should not say publicly. And there is another piece coming later that matters even more. Some of the most explosive claims surrounding Sophie right now have not actually been proven. Separating what is documented from what is rumor changes this entire story.
Have not heard the news. Enes Kanter has been on a complete media world tour, going to network, podcasts, everywhere, putting the WNBA on blast about men playing in their league. And I'm going to tell you guys once, just like I told you before, there is a very high chance that men could possibly already be playing in the league based on the guidelines of the league qualifications. Yes, I'm not saying it's true, but it looks like that's the narrative that is being thrown around by NBA legends and people like Enes Kanter.
That clip lays out the argument driving the criticism. But notice the wording. The host says there is a possibility and explicitly says he is not claiming it as established fact. That distinction has to stay intact. Enes Kanter Freedom has been publicly criticizing policies surrounding transgender participation in women's sports. Whether you agree with him or not, that is the real verifiable part of the story. He is speaking publicly, media outlets are discussing it, and now active WNBA players are being asked to respond. What should not happen is turning a hypothetical policy debate into a factual claim that a specific unidentified WNBA player is secretly male. The source does not establish that. No player is identified. No evidence proving such an allegation is presented here. And if the argument is strong enough to debate on policy grounds, it should not need an unsupported accusation attached to it. That is where Cameron Brink's reaction becomes important. She is not merely disputing one technical detail. She is rejecting the premise that this currently represents a meaningful problem inside the WNBA. Kanter's critics hear his media appearances and see provocation. His supporters hear the same appearances and see someone forcing an uncomfortable subject into public view. So already, before we even get to Sophie, you have two competing narratives fighting over the same evidence.
When it comes to the trans issues that I believe you're talking about, I think it's a non-issue, and I think it's people trying to just come for the trans community, and I just don't stand for that. I think I don't even know what the fuck his name is, Enes Kanter, like, he's a stupid piece of shit, and I think a lot of people think that, and I think he's just trying to stay relevant, so I think people are tuned in for the right reasons, and it's great that we can all talk about things that are important and hard, and you can have your opinions on that. But I think taking something that's a non-issue right now and just trying to use it for clickbait for views.
Listen carefully to the language Brink uses there. She says she believes people are coming for the trans community, describes the issue as a non-issue, questions Kanter's motivations, and suggests the attention is being generated through views, likes, and clickbait. That last part is what turns a policy disagreement personal. If Brink had simply said, "I disagree with his position," the reaction probably would have been smaller. Instead, she is challenging the legitimacy of the campaign itself. She is effectively saying the attention being given to this issue is disproportionate to what is actually happening, and there is a fair question buried inside that argument. How common is the situation people are debating? What exact WNBA rule is being challenged? Is the public discussion responding to an actual competitive dispute inside the league right now, or to a broader concern about what rules could permit? Those are different questions. At the same time, supporters of Cunningham and Kanter would answer Brink by saying policy debates often happen before a high-profile case forces everyone to react. Their position is essentially that waiting until a conflict occurs is the wrong time to decide what the standard should be. That is why calling the subject a non-issue does not make the argument disappear. It actually creates a second argument over whether preventative rules themselves deserve discussion. And now you can see why the Sophie Cunningham comparison caught fire so quickly. Sophie had already entered this discussion from almost the opposite direction.
Today, this thing kind of went dormant till about June. Now we're looking at about August, and we're still talking about this situation. We heard reports coming out yesterday that WNBA team owners could possibly be allegedly conspiring together to not issue Sophie Cunningham a 2027 contract. There has also been reports that the Indiana Fever is set to release Sophie Cunningham, cut their loss with her at the conclusion of this season. Now, all of that is yet to be proven. We have to wait and see how this season turns.
This is where the story gets messy, because those contract claims are potentially far more damaging than the original disagreement, and they remain unverified in the material we have. The source references reports alleging WNBA owners could work together to deny Cunningham a 2027 contract, and separately claims Indiana could release her after the season. Neither allegation is established here with an official Fever announcement, a named league source, a transaction, or direct confirmation from Cunningham. So those claims cannot responsibly be treated as fact. And that actually makes the verified portion of Sophie's situation more interesting. You do not need a blackballing conspiracy to understand why her comments generated attention. Cunningham publicly expressed a position on a highly polarizing issue. Once an athlete does that, fans, sponsors, teams, media outlets, and other players can all react differently. Controversy has consequences without requiring a secret coordinated campaign. Could her public positions affect how organizations view her? Possibly. Public image is part of professional sports. But saying that is possible is completely different from claiming owners have collectively agreed not to employ her. That distinction gets lost when controversy becomes content, and viewers should pay attention to it because the strongest version of this story is not some rumor we cannot prove. The stronger story is that Cunningham and Brink appear to represent two genuinely different public approaches inside the same league, at a moment when the WNBA is receiving more scrutiny than it did only a few years ago.
I wanted to say that, but she didn't feel comfortable. See, Caitlin Clark not just brought fans, casual fans to the league, she probably brought players comfortability. Even if players don't like Caitlin Clark and her fan base, they never been this outspoken. I believe that is because Caitlin Clark is bringing somewhat of a relaxation to this league to where now they can speak to the media. Now they can speak to their mind because people are listening. See, before Caitlin Clark got to this league, when nobody listened to WNBA players, when nobody even looking at this stuff, college was running.
That point about visibility deserves more attention than it usually gets. Caitlin Clark changed the scale of attention surrounding women's basketball. You do not have to credit one player for every bit of growth, and you certainly do not have to pretend women's basketball had no audience before her. But Clark arrived with an enormous college following, and that spotlight followed her into the professional game. More viewers means more microphones. More microphones mean comments that once might have stayed inside a locker room or local media session can become national arguments within hours. That changes incentives for everybody. Players who want to speak now know people are listening. Critics who want to challenge the league know people are listening. Fans who previously never followed WNBA transactions or press conferences are suddenly analyzing quotes, officiating, roster decisions, television numbers, personalities, and politics. That expanded spotlight can empower players, but it also removes a lot of the protection that comes with obscurity. Sophie Cunningham can make one comment and have it circulate far beyond the normal WNBA audience. Cameron Brink can answer one question and immediately become the center of a debate she did not create. And the league itself gets judged not only by basketball decisions, but by every cultural dispute attached to its players. That is the trade-off nobody can avoid once the audience becomes bigger. The question is not whether greater attention changed the WNBA conversation, it clearly changed the scale of it. The question is what players and teams do now that every opinion can become a national headline.
That other players is going to go through what Caitlin had to go through if another Caitlin Clark comes along, because Caitlin Clark was the blueprint to everything. It sucks to be the first doing something because now everybody's going to try to critique you, say little things about you. But for her to be a professional at all times, I take my hat off to her for that.
The host calls Clark a blueprint, and there is something worth separating there from the praise. Being first under a new level of attention is difficult because there is no established playbook. Clark entered the WNBA carrying expectations from fans who had followed her through college, while longtime WNBA audiences already had their own players, rivalries, and opinions. Every hard foul became a referendum. Every quote became evidence for somebody's larger theory. Every ratings discussion became an argument about who deserved credit. That environment now affects players who are not Caitlin Clark. Cunningham benefited from the larger spotlight when fans embraced her personality and willingness to speak directly. Brink is experiencing the other side of that same spotlight, now that a politically sensitive answer is circulating among people who may have never watched one of her games. You cannot celebrate the audience when it agrees with you, and then pretend the audience does not exist when it pushes back. But the reverse is also true. Fans criticizing an athlete's opinion does not automatically mean the athlete should lose her career over it. Public disagreement is not censorship. Brink is entitled to say she believes this is a non-issue. Cunningham is entitled to argue that girls' sports should be protected according to the standards she supports. Kanter is entitled to campaign for policy changes. Fans are entitled to challenge all three. The hard part is maintaining that distinction once everyone starts demanding punishment for the other side.
Oh, damn! I can't believe Cameron going out like this, man. So let's read some of the comments, man. Andy stated, we can call it a non-issue when 0 men and boys are playing in women's basketball. In women's and girls sports nationwide. That includes no men in women's bathrooms too. Until then, Enes Kanters and normal Americans will continue to speak out for common sense.
That comment represents the strongest counter-argument to Brink's position. Supporters of restrictions are saying the absence of a major current conflict does not make the rule question meaningless. Think about how sports regulation usually works. Leagues do not wait for every possible dispute to happen before writing eligibility rules. Weight classes exist before a heavyweight steps into the cage with a flyweight. Equipment standards exist before a dangerous piece of gear injures somebody. Age restrictions and roster requirements exist because governing bodies decide boundaries in advance. The debate then is over which boundary is appropriate here and how transgender athletes fit within it. That is a much more serious discussion than throwing insults at individual players. There are legitimate competing interests: competitive fairness, inclusion, biological differences relevant to sport, dignity for transgender athletes, opportunities for women and girls, and the practical question of how policies should vary across ages and levels of competition. Those issues become especially complicated when people collapse youth sports, elite professional competition, bathrooms, schools, and the WNBA into one giant argument. They are related politically, but they are not identical policy questions. Brink's answer is broad. Cunningham's earlier answer is broad. Kanter's campaign is broad. If anybody wants an actual policy solution instead of an internet fight, eventually the conversation has to become specific. What level of competition are we discussing? What eligibility standard? What governing body? What physiological criteria? What legal framework? That is where slogans stop being enough.
About something that makes absolutely no sense. Somebody says Sophie Cunningham versus Cameron Brink is the perfect example of how personality and morals can make all the difference in a woman. I feel like, bro, it ain't just that. The weakest men compete with girls. The weakest minds celebrate it. Ooh, that's hard. That's hard. I think men can be women. I'm calling someone else a stupid. Wow, Cameron Brink is finna get hit hard with this, bro. WNBA has...
And there is the public reaction phase, where policy arguments quickly turn into character judgments. One commenter contrasts Sophie Cunningham and Cameron Brink in terms of personality and morals. Another attacks Brink's intelligence. Others mock the WNBA itself. That tells you how far the conversation has moved from basketball. But there is a problem with deciding that one political answer proves one player has superior morals to another. If you establish that standard, every athlete becomes a political purity test. Instead of asking whether Brink's argument makes sense, people start asking whether Brink herself is a good person. Instead of examining Cunningham's reasoning, supporters turn her into a symbol who must be defended from every criticism. That is not analysis. That is team sports applied to politics. The more useful comparison is what each player is actually claiming. Cunningham's quoted position focuses on protecting girls from competing against males in sports. Brink's position in this interview is that the current controversy is a non-issue and that the trans community is being unfairly targeted. Those statements can be compared on evidence, consequences, and policy, without pretending either woman suddenly represents everything good or everything wrong with society. And that brings us back to the question we held from the beginning. Why has this story refused to disappear months after Sophie's original comments? It is not because one player delivered some magical quote that settled everything. It is because the WNBA has become a proxy battlefield for a much larger cultural disagreement, and every new player response gives both sides fresh material.
Joanna, man, too. People making fun of it, but I think people is not looking at what Enes Kanter is doing. Like, even former players be calling dude out. Y'all not looking at what he's doing. He's making a statement, and for him to be the first one to really go hard at this and to call out the WNBA for the flaws in their guideline rules, for him to be the first one to do everything he's doing, it's a profound moment in sports, bro. It is, bro. Like, some of the stuff I don't agree with that he's doing, but he's trying to make a difference.
That is probably the fairest description of what Kanter has successfully done, regardless of whether you agree with his position. He has kept the subject in circulation. The host even acknowledges that he does not agree with everything Kanter is doing. That is important, because supporting somebody's right to raise a question is not the same as endorsing every claim they make. Kanter's strategy is confrontational. He has repeatedly used media appearances to challenge organizations and public figures. That guarantees attention, but it also guarantees that critics will question whether attention itself has become part of the objective. Brink clearly believes it has. Her accusation that he is trying to stay relevant goes directly to motive, but motive is hard to prove. A person can genuinely believe in an issue and also understand that controversy generates exposure. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. The better way to judge the campaign is by the accuracy of the claims being made, the policies being proposed, and whether the evidence supports the conclusions. That standard should apply to Kanter, it should apply to Cunningham, it should apply to Brink, and it should apply to commentators covering all three. Because once evidence becomes optional, every rumor starts getting promoted to a fact, simply because it confirms somebody's worldview. That is exactly why those alleged 2027 contract claims should not become the center of the Sophie Cunningham story without confirmation. If Indiana eventually makes a roster decision, analyze the transaction when it happens. Look at her contract status, performance, roster construction, salary considerations, injuries, and statements from the team. If another club signs her, that tells you something. If no club does, you still need evidence before declaring collusion. Otherwise, you are deciding the explanation first and waiting for reality to fit it later.
Some of the stuff I don't agree with that he's doing, but he's trying to make a difference. He's putting light on a situation that never had light on it, bro. Like, we didn't know that men could really play in the league, and it's legal. They could, like, what the hell? Like, think of it's common sense.
And now we reach the part that actually decides whether this debate produces anything useful. The host says Kanter is trying to put light on a situation people were not discussing. Fine. Then the next step has to be clarity. If there is a WNBA eligibility rule people believe is flawed, quote the exact rule. If someone believes the policy creates a competitive problem, explain precisely how. If someone believes the concern is exaggerated, show why. That is how a serious sports policy debate moves forward. What does not move it forward is claiming unnamed men are already playing in the WNBA without evidence. It does not help to treat Cameron Brink as morally defective because she gave an answer you dislike. And it does not help to declare Sophie Cunningham as being secretly blackballed when the allegation remains unverified. The real divide exposed by Brink and Cunningham is more fundamental than any of that. Cunningham's position begins with the category of women's sport and asks what restrictions are necessary to protect female competition. Brink's position begins with concern about transgender people being targeted and asks whether the alleged competitive problem exists strongly enough to justify this level of attention. Those starting points naturally produce different conclusions, and neither side is going away. Women's sports are growing, more money is entering the ecosystem, more fans are watching, more athletes are building individual brands, more political organizations recognize that athletes can move public opinion. That guarantees these arguments will become more frequent, not less. The WNBA therefore has a choice of its own. It can allow policy questions to be defined almost entirely through viral clips and outside political campaigns, or it can make its rules and reasoning clear enough that fans know exactly what standard governs competition. Players face a similar choice. They can avoid the subject, which is completely legitimate. They can speak cautiously, or they can take strong positions and accept that those positions will be challenged. Cameron Brink chose to speak. Sophie Cunningham chose to speak. Their disagreement is now public, and fans are going to decide which argument they find more persuasive. But those fans should make that decision based on what the women actually said, not on invented claims attached to either one. And there is another layer here that people overlook. Athletes are not elected officials. Cameron Brink does not write eligibility law because she answered a reporter. Sophie Cunningham does not set national sports policy because she expressed an opinion. Their comments matter because they are prominent athletes inside the sport being discussed, but one player's position does not automatically represent the entire WNBA. That is why framing this as Sophie versus Cameron is emotionally powerful but analytically incomplete. The larger confrontation is between two philosophies about how women's sport should handle questions involving sex and gender. One side argues that boundaries have to be established clearly before competitive conflicts appear, especially when physical differences could matter. The other warns that hypothetical concerns can be exaggerated in ways that stigmatize a small group of people and turn them into political targets. You can disagree strongly with either position, but if you remove the insults and rumors, that is the actual argument sitting underneath all of this. And this is where Caitlin Clark's impact on attention becomes relevant again without making her responsible for the controversy. The WNBA now exists under a brighter spotlight. A press conference answer that once might have traveled through a small basketball audience can reach millions of people who follow culture and politics more closely than the league standings. That means the league cannot assume these conversations will stay inside basketball media. Neither can the players. Every sentence can be clipped. Every hesitation can be interpreted. Every strong opinion can create supporters and critics overnight. That can be uncomfortable, but it is also what comes with becoming more culturally relevant. The worst response would be pretending the discussion is not happening. The better response is demanding better evidence from everybody participating in it. If Kanter says a rule creates a problem, show the rule and explain the problem. If Brink says the controversy is a non-issue, explain why the current competitive landscape supports that conclusion. If Cunningham argues girls need protection in sport, define what policy she believes actually accomplishes that protection. Then viewers can judge arguments instead of personalities. Because the moment you separate the verified statements from the unverified rumors, this story looks very different. There is no confirmed evidence in this material that WNBA owners have collectively decided to block Sophie Cunningham from a 2027 contract. There is no established evidence here proving an unidentified male player is currently competing in the WNBA. Those are claims that require far more proof than this source provides. What we do have is real enough on its own. We have Sophie Cunningham publicly taking one position. We have Cameron Brink publicly taking another. We have Enes Kanter Freedom pushing the subject aggressively through the media. And we have an increasingly large WNBA audience reacting to every development. That is the payoff. The controversy is not staying alive because somebody has conclusively proven the most sensational allegation. It is staying alive because nobody has resolved the underlying policy and cultural disagreement, while the league now has an audience large enough to amplify every new quote. So choose the argument you actually believe. Is Cameron Brink right that this is being inflated into a controversy that targets the trans community? Or is Sophie Cunningham's approach stronger because eligibility boundaries should be settled before a major competitive dispute forces the issue? Pick one and explain why in the comments, because I want to know what standard you would actually use, not just which player you like more. And if you want more breakdowns where we separate the confirmed facts from the rumors before choosing a side, like the video and subscribe.